Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are dialing in from. Uh, can I take this opportunity to welcome you all to the latest in our series on energy transition and energy and climate justice that very kindly our blog editor Dipali Srivastav has put together. The blog is called Energy Explained, and I'd really encourage you to go to our website and follow the work that we do on that. Thanks again also to Vincent, who's put together this event and has kind of organized all the logistics for all the organizational help. This initiative is a co-production between the India program at the Center on Global Energy Policy, the CEPA Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Climate and Engagement Committee, the Columbia Climate School, the Ambedkar Initiative, and the South Asia Institute. Today's event, Resource Extraction and Energy Equity, explores the deep challenges India faces in ensuring its energy transition is equitable and just at a time when the country is increasing both its reliance on renewables as well as coal to meet the incredible growth in energy demand that's happening here. This is the latest installment in a series examining social and economic justice issues related to climate change and the energy transition in India. We had the first session on January 28th that examined the issue of climate justice within countries such as India that have a deep-rooted and intersecting structures of inequity based on caste, gender, and religion. The second session on February 9th integrated hard data and social sciences to show that climate injustice in India is essentially caste injustice, for example, by looking at who are the workers who bear the brunt of heat in India as the planet warms. Following today's event, our next final session will be a webinar on March 22nd, examining the past, present, and future of India's environmental justice movements in a global context. This series particularly celebrates the legacy of modern Indian Republic's founding father, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who is a Columbia alum, receiving his PhD in economics in 1927 and then an honorary degree here in 1952. Many of us in this part of the world are just learning about him as he features prominently in Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste and Eva DuVernay's new film, highly recommended, Origins. The film's opening night earlier in January in Columbia University's Pulitzer Hall, President Minouche Shafik noted the university's pride in Dr. Ambedkar's legacy and highlighted his global relevance. This series has received terrific response from a cross-disciplinary audience, reinforcing our commitment here at the Center on Global Energy Policy to recognizing how important climate justice and inclusion are in the energy transition. This is a priority research area for us, particularly for me. And as we kind of explore these issues in the vast swathe of the world that's only now getting connected to modern energy markets. This session will feature two experts whose research and reporting in India's coal heartlands brings attention to the importance of bottom-up engagement in shaping just transitions. Scholar Dr. Vasudha Chotre and award-winning journalist Ankul Paliwal will be in a conversation moderated by me, Kaushik Dev. I'm a senior research scholar and lead of the India program at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Just a few words about our two speakers. Ankur is an award-winning journalist covering science, inequity, and queer people. He's an independent queer journalist and founder and managing editor of queerbeat.org, a collaborative journalism featured on accurately covering LGBTQIA plus communities in India. In his over a decade career of journalism so far, he's reported about science, equity, inclusion in communities from India, Ethiopia, Ghana, Tanzania, Kenya, Germany, United States, for publications in journals such as Nature, Scientific American, The Guardian, 52. He's been awarded reporting grants by Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, Alfred Friendly Press Partners, Ground Truth, and many others. But kind of importantly for us, and a matter of pride, he's got a master's degree in science journalism from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism in New York. In 2021, he was a fellow at the Entrepreneurial Journalism Creators Program at the City University of New York. Vasudha is the professor of politics and development, scholar on global development at the University of East Anglia. She's a political scientist specializing in two distinct but interrelated areas of research: the politics and governance of natural resource use and extraction, and the larger politics of development of the Indian state. She's worked extensively on the relationship between natural resources and politics, both at the micro and the macro level, mostly in India and the South Asian context. She brings a novel critical perspective to these areas through an interdisciplinary research approach that is informed by developmental studies, comparative politics, and political ideology. She specializes in the study of extractive regimes, disaster politics, and citizenship controversies. She has a doctoral degree in development studies from SOAS, the University of London. Before I hand it over to our two speakers, can I just make a couple of logistical announcements as well? The event is being broadcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. It's open to the press and on the record. We will have our speakers present their views for the next few minutes before we open it up for a question and answer in a moderated discussion. If I can kind of also encourage you to put in your comments, question and answers under the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen so that we can take them up as the discussion goes forward. Having done this introductory piece and set the stage, hopefully, for our speakers to go forward, can I now invite Vasudha to share her views before we Ankur to step in as well?
Thank you, Kaushik. That's wonderful and a great privilege to be here with you all. I'm going to try and share my screen now, so just please bear with me for a quick second. Could you confirm if you're able to see my screen?
Yes, your screen is visible. You might want to make it, yes, perfect now.
Okay, perfect. My talk today is titled Coal Communities and Coal Lands at a Moment of Just Transition in India. So, of course, we recognize that this is a historic moment when it is being widely understood and acknowledged that a just energy transition is paramount for India for many reasons. This is a country where nearly 400 million people still lack access to electricity. Urban emissions are 2.5 times higher than rural ones. And many energy-deprived people still live in the coal heartlands of the eastern central parts of the country. And they are also disproportionately vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Now, there are a number of different definitions of just transition, but I'll just present one from the ILO. And here it's very clearly mentioned that a just transition is about greening the economy in a way that is fair and inclusive, as fair and inclusive as possible to everyone concerned, creating decent work opportunities and leaving no one behind. Of course, in India, there's a lot of interest, and Indian policy communities are extremely motivated by this concept as India contemplates the way forward. It's become a bit of a catch-all term. Now, my interest today is in trying to understand where coal fits in within this historic moment of a just transition. The plain fact is that coal is at the heart of India's energy capacity. In this figure here, we see the installed capacity, and we can see that coal and coal-based infrastructural assets are over 50% of the total assets that produce electricity. And when we look at the actual use of those assets and share in generation, in actual generation, then we find that the share of coal is even greater, around 73.4%. So it isn't really conceivable to simply substitute coal with renewable energy. It's not what happens. Energy transitions, the literature tells us, are very complex matters. They are not restricted to simply technical choices around fuels and energy technologies. And in the context of India, we are told that just transitions are just not a matter of scaling up solar capacity in coal mining areas. I think we should note that upfront. There is a bit of quirky geography, if you like. Key coal producing states are simply not endowed with huge amounts of solar and wind potential. For example, out of India's 1,050 gigawatt wind and solar potential, Jharkhand, which is a key coal producer, accounts for just 1.7%. And in fact, it is states in the west and in the south that actually contain the bulk of this potential. So there is a clear mismatch there anyway. Now, coal employs a lot of people, and it is estimated that there are about 13 million workers engaged in coal, many of whom work in the informal sector. And India is the second largest global coal producer after China. And there are estimates coming from, say, the Global Energy Monitor in the US, that the state-owned Coal India Limited, which is one of the world's greatest and largest coal mining companies, will in fact face significant layoffs by 2050, estimating that 73,800 direct workers would be affected, and no doubt many other informal workers as well because of the interdependencies. Many of these layoffs, that is, will unfold in highly coal-dependent districts in these main coal-producing states, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, which also have a very large percentage of unskilled labor, high levels of multidimensional poverty, and a very high pollution rate. That many of the same people that have been dispossessed of lands are also energy deprived is surely one of the greatest climate and environmental injustices imaginable. This table simply shows that Jharkhand, Orissa, and Chhattisgarh, the three main coal-producing states, earn significant revenues from it and continue to earn significant revenues from it. There is, in fact, a clear increase even just from 2022 to 2023. Given the sheer scale of land that is locked into coal, it's important to note that there is a thriving political economy around it, and there are multiple institutions and stakeholders that are dedicated and have long been dedicated to precisely ensuring the endurance of coal, and that's not going to go away quickly. There are also concerns, to look at the flip side, that were this coal production to in fact reduce, then these very states would also face significant fiscal constraints. Overall, though, if we were to look at this very quickly, coal production has been increasing. The target for Coal India Limited is 1 billion ton by 2024, 2 billion ton by 2030. And with imports, it's an interesting picture because import dependence does contribute to about 20 to 25% of total coal consumption. And reducing coal imports is a high state priority, and there are multiple commitments made to this effect. However, we do not see any sustained trend of decline, especially with coking coal imports, but even with non-coking coal. It is just not sustained. And that, of course, means that if there are more pressures to reduce imports, that would, the government would want to increase domestic production to meet the demand. So, of course, I think it's no surprise that we see statements like this, that there are, there are strong targets, there are firm targets. Coal India Limited gearing up for 1 billion ton. That was an announcement back in 2015. More recently, that was exacerbated to 2 billion ton, and that the government is holding firm on that. For those of us who study this, we don't find this at all surprising. Considering the sheer importance of coal for India, the sheer embeddedness economically, energy-wise, socially, and of course, politically. So that's by way of a broad context, and that takes me to the topic that concerns me today: the coal communities and coal lands. Now, those familiar with the history of coal mining in India will be aware that the people living in these coal heartlands have faced a long history of injustices. And it is also true that many of these injustices resonate deeply with the kinds of economic and social contradictions and conflicts that are observed in other mining frontiers globally. So coal mining began, first of all, with an expansion into forested areas where Adivasis, India's indigenous people, mostly live, and over time undermined forest-based and agricultural livelihoods and caused widespread environmental pollution, particularly with the shift from underground to open cast mining, and with matters made much worse because of very lax enforcement of pollution protocols and environmental standards. The coal workforce, and there's a lot of very interesting literature about this, is a highly differentiated workforce. So it's a mistake to think of the coal community or coal communities in any kind of singular or homogeneous way. So there are the more privileged public sector workers that coexist with a much larger informal shadow economy. There is also thriving artisanal mining, which strictly speaking is illegal but critical for the livelihoods of poor Adivasis and lower caste groups, like the coal scavengers and the coal cyclewalas, as seen in this picture. Very importantly, we find that there is evidence of increased differentiation along the lines of key social cleavages of class and caste, gender and tribe, not to mention questions of insider and outsider to do with both inward migration into coal areas as well as outward migration. In a context where jobs are few, employment is insecure, and the steady destruction of forests and other commons has produced widespread alienation and a breakdown of community relations. So these are the sort of histories of the nested injustices, which brings me to the question, are we at a moment of revaluation? Is there a new moment in this long history that asks for a fresh consideration? And this is exactly what motivates a new research project that is looking at the sustainable futures of coal lands in Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and Orissa. And our key questions are guided by this basic motivation that what are the ground conditions for coal communities that must live within the coal economy? There is no escape from it, but are also faced with the prospects of some elements of coal closures in the coming years. What forms of dispossession are they still faced with? What kinds of livelihood struggles do they encounter, and what are their concerns? And I'm very privileged to be part of a very inspiring project research team, and I'm grateful to many of my colleagues for their contributions for this talk today. This rare longitudinal study of coal communities in Telangana with observations in 2011 and 2012 gives us some sobering insights into what it means to live with coal in India. And taking a long-term view, this paper shows how there are three dimensions of dispossession and exclusion that have been operating in very temporally interrelated ways, reinforcing one another. And I think it's quite useful and insightful for this talk to look at these three stages. So the first stage is sort of when mines are set to open, and it's the sort of initial years of mining planning and establishment and operations, which lead to widespread displacement and dispossession, which are, of course, mostly settled in exchange for cash compensation. Now, the same people may have been displaced multiple times. Say once in the historical past, in previous decades, when mining expansions caused a village to relocate from forests to agricultural plains, and then again when underground mines may have been converted to open pit mines. There are multiple cases where displaced communities were not given titles to lands when they were displaced for the first time, which means that they could be evicted the second time without either land, cash, or jobs. Moreover, as a very rich literature tells us, the negotiations around compensation are terribly fraught, contingent on the possession of valid land titles and unfolding over a period of time, which means that various successive central and state policies are invoked, sometimes with contradictions. And Adivasis and Dalits are frequently marginalized in these transactions, although not always in the expected ways. The second stage is when the mine itself becomes a fait accompli, and that then means that the economic and physical landscape both change, opening up to a new phase where community lives become more firmly, almost irrevocably intertwined with an expanding coal economy. And there is a lure of secure public sector employment that constantly motivates demands and negotiations, though that is only available to a few and is increasingly on the decline with the increased participation of private actors. It's also true that mining ushers in an expansion of a local cash-based economy, which could represent an opportunity for some, especially those with formal education, but the benefits of this are fairly sort of limited. Now, crucially, during this time, open pit mining has triggered widespread landscape changes, and there has been a steep decline in agricultural and forestry-based livelihoods and an erosion in community relations. This is all happening at this time. And research is showing that all these differentiations based on caste, class, gender, tribe, and so on in the coal areas are manifesting in a huge fragmentation and splintering of resistance, very different kinds of demands, points of protest, all unfolding within microspaces. Stage 3 is when coal mines may close after several decades of operation. However, in India, and this I think is quite important for today's discussion, closures generally do not occur because of climate change concerns or because local communities have protested, but because remaining coal is too expensive to excavate as compared to other comparable domestic deposits. So the realities of living around closing or closed mines are incredibly complex. And as this wonderful paper tells us, people are living in a situation where there have been no formal mine closures, not even the old underground mines. And instead of being closed, they talk of how 2 old underground mines have been converted into open cast mines, and a third one is operating at very low levels of capacity. So there are situations in other coal fields, including in Western Orissa, where underground mines are temporarily in disuse but not formally closed. So people are constantly living around some mines that are operating, some mines that are half operating, some mines that are not, and other mines that are opening. If I could just summarize from what is sort of the state of the art of knowledge on this, on coal energy dispossession and the form it takes, it is often the multiplication of many disaggregated, incremental, and small acts of land acquisition, a little bit here, a little bit there. But when taken together, it does produce a fairly cumulative land grab that is stretched across both time and space. So that, of course, means that there is a certain temporality and a spatiality of not yet happening closure, but which encompasses temporary mines being reopened. And it's an incredibly complicated and messy situation. Strangely echoing reality, the policy seems to be equally unclear. There is very little evidence of responsible mine closures within this liminal situation. In fact, in India, a mine closure plan is mandatory as part of a national approval process before a mine can, in fact, be opened. The National Mineral Policy of 2019 highlighted the significance of scientific mine closures in an orderly and systematic fashion, focusing on restoring ecology and on socioeconomic aspects. Now, there is limited literature, but this one study by this Delhi-based nonprofit Center for Social and Economic Progress raises some critical areas of concern. One, there is a lack of publicly available data on mine closures, which makes transparent assessments harder. There are no effective mechanisms to track and assess the utilization of funds for mine closure activities. For whatever little evidence there is of planning, the focus remains very much on physical and environmental aspects, less so on socioeconomic, cultural, other political aspects, which means a holistic consideration is not really happening. And this study also mentions that there is no mining company is a part of the International Council on Mining and Metals, where incorporating its guidelines could make mine closure activities more effective, more sustainable. So that's a sort of broader policy situation, which leads me to ask, could India be at a very critical juncture as far as the future of coal lands is concerned? Now, from what information is coming through into the public domain, we understand that the government of India is working with the World Bank and the GIZ to develop a mine closure framework based on just transition principles. And we are, of course, awaiting more details. But we understand that these proposals aim to create a mine closure framework on a pilot basis for mines in Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh that have previously been closed, abandoned, or are about to be closed due to resource exhaustion, and then develop a few closed mines as pilot projects. So this is an incredibly important initiative. But it's important to note that there is a large literature already that suggests that that things are quite concerning in the way that mine closures have been handled across the global south. There is a production of immense landscapes of waste and abandonment. And particularly concerning is that extraction is constantly happening. So there is a continuum of extraction and extractive activities that are taking place alongside after mine closures, creating new resource frontiers, extending extractive activities. And we see this happening in our fieldwork. So that then means, and it's not surprising, that too often mined lands, I wouldn't say become, because they always were, remain shadow places and sacrifice zones even after mine closure. And they continue to service more privileged groups and regions, both within the country and beyond, which are very serious questions for both climate and environmental justice. Now, of course, at this point, land could be restored. It could be returned or restituted to local communities. But this would require significant work, significant investment, significant will to do this, to restore the landscape, to raise new forests, to regenerate the commons, to clear and stabilize waste dump areas, and so on and so forth. But this is not easy, as research from other mining areas like Kalimantan in Indonesia tell us. It's not easy. It would be a big mistake to assume that any handovers of land back to the community, even were they to be attempted, could be some kind of textbook exercise in community harmony, because these processes in themselves could be very conflictual. Inevitably, different stakeholders within the coal communities do have very different visions of what purposes this land could be used for, and understanding this is something we're trying to do in our research currently. However, it is also important that we note that we find little evidence that such processes are even being considered. The information that is coming through into the public domain suggests that coal lands, or should I say de-coal lands, are being thought of as sort of new frontiers for new industrial investments. So here I have a few examples, again, all from what's out there in the news. We are told that there are plans for using de-coaled lands for green projects like integrated solar projects, or to diversify towards different sources of energy by creating pump storage hydropower on closed mines for generating hydroelectricity, or creating eco-parks on reclaimed land by using sustainable mining practices. Nowhere in these reports or press releases are there details on local consultations with communities, opportunities for locals to shape the decisions that are taken, or views on social and employment benefits that are arising from these new potentially profitable ventures. So this is an area for research and for understanding what is going on. In the meanwhile, Coal India has embraced a greening of coal narrative. And in its own words, coal and lignite PSUs that are public sector undertakings have not only enhanced their production level over the years to meet the rising energy demand of the country, but also shown their sensitivity and care towards native environments by adopting various mitigation measures, including the reclamation of mined out areas and extensive plantations in and around coal-bearing areas. Returning the lands disturbed by mining to stable and productive post-mining land uses is fundamental to responsible environmental stewardship. So, very lofty ambitions there. Now, one of the most important steps is to encourage plantations in and around coal areas. This is generally a field where a lot still needs to be clarified, a lot still needs to be understood. There are some cases coming through in research as reported in the paper by Oscarson et al. 2024, where lands are intended to be handed back to the Forest Department when the mines close in the coming years, even though the environmental clearance plans of the mines had an explicit condition specifying that the land after mining shall be brought back for agricultural purposes. Now, of course, very difficult to say much more with certainty because neither mine closure nor forest plantations are discussed in any kind of coherent manner. So there is that problem of transparent information, of clear presentation of material in these documents. It's more than likely, though, that the rationale for plantation is strongly linked to the Compensatory Afforestation Fund Act of 2016, which is India's showpiece effort to ensure that forest lands that are getting diverted for non-forest purposes like industrial or infrastructural development is mandatorily accompanied by afforestation efforts on at least an equal area of land. Again, the news reports on this suggest that there are concerns about its effectiveness, the practical implementations. Can you actually raise a forest through plantations and so on? Will this actually pave the way for greater forest clearance? There are concerns, especially when the afforestation itself amounts to not very much, or if the land released is of poor quality, or if there are monocultures, or if it is just plain unclear how these initiatives will actually help local communities that may have depended on their past forested habitats in very substantive ways. So this is an area for urgent research. So moving on, the Coal Ministry has also stated that diversification is a felt necessity, was felt a necessity, especially in the light of the climate change narrative. And this is necessary for many reasons, one of which is to secure new businesses, but also to secure the long-term growth of future and growth of these coal mining areas. Now, again, this is something that needs to be looked into, but just reading, just gleaning from what's, again, coming through into the public domain, it seems that there remains a strong attachment to the endurance of coal production under the diversification agenda, because if you see the key proposals, they are to establish coal thermal power plants at coal pit heads to drastically slash coal production costs, or to invest in coal gasification projects where instead of burning the fossil fuel to produce thermal power, it is chemically transformed into synthetic gas, which enables coal in far-off locations to be exploited. And I was looking into this even back in 2000, and I think it was 14 or 15, the BBC reported about these projects in China and was raising concerns that gasification may be cleaner in terms of local pollution impacts, but still produces more carbon dioxide than a traditional coal-fired plant, and is therefore worse from the climate change perspective. So I'm not a scientist, and while the latest science on this is definitely an issue to highlight and to look out for, it's potentially concerning to see these new modes of justification for coal and how these initiatives might square up with community voices for inclusion in the future of these decoaled lands. Okay, so in the last 5 minutes or so, let me turn my attention to what states might do. I think it would be good to start with what they have done and what they are doing. Now, states in India are very powerful actors as far as the organization of extraction or mining goes, and especially since 1991, when economic liberalization was ushered in, a largely centralized setup for mineral resource governance has coexisted with the so-called broker states that compete with one another for investment, including in coal mining, of course. And in previous research with Adhikari in 2020, I argued that subnational extractive regimes have shaped coal mining for very long. And these extractive regimes operate on an interplay between three critical dimensions: the political history and organization of the state, its institutional capacity and effectiveness, and how the state manages resistance. And crucially, we argued that these three dimensions make up this extractive regime that then crucially impacts upon dynamics of exclusion and inclusion within the extractive processes that are unleashed. I believe that it is inevitable that extractive regimes will shape the political character of any transition away from coal. To just mention in very practical terms, all three states, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and Orissa, are coal-bearing states. They are all encouraging renewable energy development, attracting private investment, and essentially competing with one another and other states too to encourage private investment. So how they're doing this and how their respective extractive regimes are shaping these processes is another fertile area for research. For now, I will just make the point that something very interesting is going on with all three states, something rather similar, which to me seems like a sort of a double movement in the sense that While making overtures towards just transition planning, we find that each of these states is doing something in that general area, if not just transition, then carbon budgeting, while also envisioning an expansion in coal mining and production at the same time. So it's echoing what is happening nationally. We're seeing that being replicated here too. And of course, it's not surprising because all of these are highly coal dependent states. I've already shown you figures which show how much, why it matters for these states, because there's so much revenue involved, so much land locked in. So it's not a surprise. But it is interesting and I think notable at this point, at this moment of just transition, that it's a double movement. And in each of these states, I've just put a few synoptic or indicative points just to show that there is just transition planning, but also auctions or other kinds of inaugurations of coal infrastructures going on pretty much at the same time. There's also, evidence of carbon budgeting in Orissa, which is an interesting state. Because of all of its history of cyclones, there is a very active disaster management mission. It's a very climate planning active state. So there is that carbon budgeting that is also happening. Now, it just leads me to think, if allowing carbon metrics to predominate thinking about decarbonization won't also result in vast social and environmental consequences, and there's a lot of literature about this. The prerogative of carbon over biodiversity, as these authors have, I think, very eloquently put it, in my view, can allow these kinds of double movements to be sustained. And it becomes then very much possible for states to pursue carbon budgets with measurable, reportable, verifiable results, but without making much of a dent to fossil developmentalism. I'm just going to wrap up in the next 2 minutes, Kaushik, if that's okay. So just to conclude, I was struck by this quote from a trade union representative in a coal area in Telangana, cited in that paper by Oscarson Krishnan and Lahiri Dutt 2024. He says, and I quote, "Of course, we have heard about climate change, but anyone speaking of moving out of coal by 2070 is just spouting nonsense. This talk of the coal sector finishing off is very old. India is not so developed. So we have to continue to depend upon coal." And this is not some government minister saying this. It's not somebody in Delhi saying this. This is a person on the ground. And it really made me think that, what does this tell us about the larger subjectivity of people in the coal areas? How much are they able to think beyond coal? Well, pretty much not much. And the biggest concern, therefore, surely is the lack of options that coal communities face within an increasingly uncertain future. A lot of people have lost land not once, not twice, sometimes even more than that. The commons are eroded. There are few skills to speak of. And as my colleague in my project team, Nikas Kindo, who has worked closely with Adivasi communities in Jharkhand for more than a decade, said, and I quote Nikas here because I couldn't say it better myself, "There is a missing discussion in all these transition talks, those who have already transitioned from agrarian to coal informal workers and are now meant to be moving on to a post-coal future, but are not in a position to negotiate on any terms." So how are they going to imagine if they can't even negotiate? Can there be any just post-coal future if the doubly and trebly disadvantaged coalfield communities have no agency? And which then leads me to my final slide. Has the time come to demand a closed coalfield land rights and restitution act? It's a question that Patrick and I asked in an opinion piece for EPW in 2021. We wondered if there should be such an act, a legislative framework to follow on from the examples of other progressive laws like the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act, 2006. And such an act would return coal lands on a collective rights basis to coalfield communities as coal becomes a thing of the past. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm aware that not all laws are upheld. I also know that recent governments have done a lot to dilute laws all over the world. But perhaps a move could have powerful symbolic and material consequences. Coalfield communities are struggling with insecure employment. They are locked into endless bargains over essentially meager sums of compensation that are no substitute for lands lost. And this is important. There is an individualization of demands over time, which itself is a response to the individual compensation strategies pursued by coal companies, whether public or private. So we wonder if such an act could restore collective agency and re-energize the commons in a severely denuded context of coalfield areas, which are constantly the subject of other extractive ventures. We realize this is not a panacea. There will be a lot of need for investment into these lands. But could this be brought into a dialogue? Is the thought I would like to leave you with. Would such an act appeal to any political parties or coalitions, given that it would, of course, go against the grain of very commonly pervasive extractive philosophies? And the road ahead will be difficult for many people, like that man in that photo of a closed coal mine area from Western Orissa, sent by my colleague Tithi just this morning, who's doing fieldwork. And certainly for him and many others, it will be a very difficult and uncertain road ahead, but can we imagine a different future? So I'll stop there. Sorry for overshooting a little bit. Thank you.
No, not at all. Thanks, Vasudha. I mean, that was truly a tour de force and extremely informative. Learned a lot in this body of research. I can't even come to emphasize how important all of this is in our understanding of what's happening in the just energy transition process and all the humongous challenges that we are facing. We have a fairly active conversation already happening in the Q&A box. So I'd encourage all our participants to join that and put in their comments and questions there. But let me before I go to those, ask Ankur to share his thoughts.
I mean, I'm amazed at seeing Vasudha's presentation, how beautifully she has captured what's going on in India. And because what I'm going to talk about is more village level work, how communities think and make decisions about coal, how involved they are or want to be, but how they're actually kept off the discussion or off the table. And that would sort of give us some understanding of how this just transition conversation is playing out. Thank you, Vasudha, for covering the bigger ground, the bigger landscape on which my conversation sort of will give a sense of how it's playing out at a very micro level, at a village level, all of the things that you touched on, the policy changes, how communities are thinking, the mining closure and everything. So I'll just share my presentation here. Just hold on. Is it visible? Good. Okay. Yeah. As I was mentioning earlier, Vasudha has already covered the bigger ground. What I'm going to talk about essentially is what I worked on, a story. I spent some 2 years figuring out how the recent changes that the Indian government has made in the laws, whether it's Forest Rights Act or the several kinds of mining acts, how it is playing out on the ground and how much communities are involved. I was writing about a mine in Chhattisgarh, and this is the story that I wrote about. The mine is called the Parsa East Kete Basan coal mine, shortly PEKB. It's one of the mines in India that almost every Indian paper has written about multiple times. Almost every international paper has written about multiple times. And the conversation has gone like that the Indian government is giving out more and more mining contracts to private companies. And people on the ground are protesting and they don't want to give their lands. And this, when I had gone to visit the village with this understanding, people would go to these protest sites and then come back home, or they are having a tea at their tea stall or sitting at a bus stop. And I would talk to them about do they actually think that they can stop this mine from coming, although they are holding these protests? And some of them very candidly would tell you or told me that they didn't think so. So they would go and present some sort of a communal face that they all are resisting against this mine, but internally felt quite powerless that they would be able to do so. And that sort of presented an interesting question that I wanted to explore, is how over and over, and it has played out across India and in different parts of the world, is that communities get united when they hear about that a coal project is going to be cleared in their village or in nearby areas. All of them come together and protest. But over the years, the protest dissipates and the village divides, and the mine comes in eventually. So I was just trying to understand this dynamics, how it plays out. I don't need to talk much about Gautam Adani. A lot has been written about, and several links have been made how the rise of Prime Minister Modi in the last 10 years is linked with rise of industrialists like Adani. Now Adani is present in almost every sector you name, whether it's sewage treatment plants, solar power plants, food farms, batteries, data processing. He's involved in every sector, and very much so in mining. And most of the private contracts that are being given about these days are MDOs, mining development orders, where and Adani sort of takes pride in saying that he's the one, or his company is the one who has come up with the MDOs. What it essentially means is that what government tells the private companies is, you go ahead, clear, get the mining clearances, negotiate with the villagers on compensation, talk about the rehabilitation. Everything that the government used to do earlier is now what private developers are doing. So to understand how it's playing out and why people were feeling so powerless in the village that I was working in, when I started having conversations with them, there was one thing that emerged consistently in the conversations, and that was that we were divided. It was almost like that they didn't believe that this division will happen or will play out, but saw it playing out in front of them. And they kept referring to an older village that was there 10 years ago, which was destroyed. And everybody I would talk to would refer that the same thing will happen to us while they were going out and protesting. So what I did is that I started tracking down all the villagers, most of the villagers who lived in that village. The village was called Kete. And now we're scattered across Chhattisgarh, far away districts. Some lived close, some lived away. And for example, this man, Kalyan Ram, who lived close to actually the mine. And these are the two cousin brothers, Pathar and Bhole, whom I wrote about in the story, who have now set up a factory quite far away from the village. And this is the activist who has, Alok Shukla, who has been working in the area for quite some time. And I was having conversations with all these people. And what I had also done is that I had filed a lot of freedom of information requests, which we call right to information in India, to understand what the village level documents were saying when these meetings were happening in the village, when these public consultations were happening in the village about the coal mine. What did they reflect? Did people actually consent to the mine or not? how much were they involved in the whole process. And as I started looking into these documents and started talking to most of these communities, it became very clear is that um, they didn't have any say in the process of how the mine is going to be um, cleared in a sense on the ground. The meetings that were held in the villages. I'll explain you the process that couple of villagers I spoke to told me, which when I spoke to more experts, they called it social engineering of extraction. The way it plays out on the ground is that the local government and the corporates, Adani here, would find would in some ways work with the local villagers, those who had more power in the community. These are privileged caste people. They would work with them and tell them that you go and speak to more villagers on the ground. They would essentially exploiting the existing social hierarchies in the villages. So what they would do is that they would go to the privileged caste communities in the village, would tell them that this mine is coming. This is going to bring in lots of benefits into the village. You would have a school. You can get a job in a nearby city or can get a land. So a dream was shown to all these villagers, and they started even financing local festivals that were happening in the villages. They were told that if there is a wedding in the village or if a child is born, they could come anytime and ask for money from the company that was being set up in the villages. So suddenly there was a lot of money pouring in to the village that earlier the villagers had no access to or understanding of or didn't know how to use. And that played on their psyche of they in some ways couldn't understand how what do we do with this money that's coming into the village. What these companies had also started doing is that they started plugging in long existing gaps, such as there were no schools in the village. Suddenly, then more schools were coming in. There was no healthcare facilities in the village. Adani and other companies are building in more health facilities. So they started feeling that the company and the local government wants their benefits. When they would go to these village level meetings, every time they said they would be told that the mine is for their benefit. And if they consent, this is the new future they are going to see. But none of the times they were told about the Forest Rights Act, that they had the power, the veto power to say no to the mine, or they could negotiate, or they were never told about the pollution, harmful effects of the mining. So in some sense, the information that they were getting from the local leaders who were working with the government and corporates, it was a one-sided information of it's all going to be beneficial for them, but had no understanding of how it would all eventually play out. There was a lot of manipulation of documents that was done. They would go to these meetings, and at the end of the meeting would get over, where they would be told about the benefits of the mine. The meeting would get over, and they would be asked to sign on a piece of paper that they have attended the meeting. So they would all sign, but the matter of that they have consented to the mine would be written later. All the people, the local leaders of the village and the representatives of the company would come together and then write that matter. That is how a lot of consent papers that I had seen were written. Which clearly shows that people did not consent or did not have enough information to be a part of this process. When I was talking to the villagers about how it played out in their lives, and then when I took this question to a lot of scholars, the question was that, is it persuasion or is it manipulation that's happening? What I learned from these conversations with the local activists, the scholars and people, is that people kind of didn't have a choice to imagine a different future. What I'm trying to say is that they had just one kind of information with them, and didn't know that they could actually, what they were getting, they could refuse. So all of them eventually said yes, and the village broke, and everybody came to the other side. And now the situation there is that a new township has been created outside the village, outside the mine that was there. And I met several people there, including Gangavati, who was quite upset with the way the resettlement was done. She was one of the many people who raised her voice several times against the mine, but none of her or the concerns of people like her were never reflected in all the papers I had seen. When she had her house in the village, there were some 18 rooms that she was living into. Now there were just 2 rooms that were given to her and her husband. Her husband worked with Adani as an electrician. The house had no electricity, or would come just sometimes. So there was this sense of being cheated in the whole process. And so I'm using just this story roughly to talk about how little people know about the larger level conversation that's going on at the policy level, what the national governments are deciding, what the local governments are talking about. And when we speak of just transition, and I was having conversation the other day with the local leaders and some of these people that I've stayed in contact with, none of them actually understand what it means. Their lives are still quite locked in the coal economy that they are working with. They are still going to the same mine that they have been going to for 10 years. There are no alternates, job alternates that have been shown to them. No discussions have happened with the villagers that are around this mine. I've heard several conversations that are happening at the district level or at the state level about just transition, but none of these are being reflected in the local communities. Their lives are still the same that they were 10 years ago when this village was being uprooted. And now all the villages that are fighting, protesting against the coal mine as it's being expanded in Parsai East, Khete Basan in Chhattisgarh. The just transition conversation is just not reflected on the ground. Nobody has come to have any consultation with them about whether it's related to mine closure or any other jobs that they could do. whether they are, and it's all across irrespective of their economic situation or the social strata. So that makes me wonder. As I explained in the story that I did earlier, is that there's a total they're consciously kind of kept away from the table, and that's why there is no involvement of these communities in these conversations. Which is why, as we plan just transition and talk of all these conversations that are happening, I doubt, and a lot of local activists that I have spoken to on the ground doubt that it actually is going to be just or equitable in terms of people's involvement in the process. The question everybody is asking on the ground is who is really talking about the just transition energy equity. People on the ground are just not involved. Those were some of the points that I wanted to make, essentially to highlight a point that how disenfranchised people are from the whole conversation, how excluded they are from the whole conversation. Whether it's of mine clearance, the way decisions are being taken on the ground, or the new conversation that's beginning related to just transition. Those were some of the points I wanted to make, and I'm happy to take other questions.
Thanks, Ankur. This was a really powerful story, and something that has kind of made a great impression, and at least kind of to me has kind of had a very significant impact. The questions are getting populated in the Q&A box. I'm sure you guys have visibility of that as well. But let me kind of just kick this off by asking Vasudha to just comment on the initiative and the effort in Jharkhand around the Just Transition Task Force.
Hey, thanks, Kaushik. Let me have a look at the question. Is it the one by Hari?
So Hari has kind of made a couple of points around the Jharkhand Task Force on Just Transition. So I wanted to kind of just test if you had any views or thoughts around that.
Yeah, I just have a quick look. So UNDP is supporting and community. I mean, that's good to hear because I think, I mean, Hari probably may know more than I do about the task force, but my understanding of how things have gone so far is that these are sort of quite heavily shaped by, so they're sort of relatively more top-down initiatives. I mean, I'm very willing to be corrected if that's not the case. My sense is that there is still some way to go with wide-ranging consultations at the community level. But it's sort of not just community level consultations, also the kinds of actors that we are wanting to engage with at the grassroots level. I mean, Jharkhand has a really rich landscape of social activism, different kinds of formations and civil organizations, so trade unions and other kinds of movements. So is there that kind of broad, inclusive kind of dialogue happening? I think that's where we need to go to capture that full range of perspectives for all the reasons that we both, Ankur and I, have kind of tried to mention in the talk. I mean, you could have community consultations, but they don't necessarily need to be very widespread or inclusive. They could be, I'm not saying that they are, but they could be relatively narrow. It's possible in theory.
I mean, I kind of recognize that, and also one of the comments in the chat, one of the participants has made that as we kind of do the energy transition and we kind of go away from coal to something else, for whatever it's worth, that's still extractive.
Yeah.
And unless we're kind of able to solve or able to understand and resolve this issue around the justice in the energy transition piece, we will just kind of end up doing the same thing over and over again, except that instead of coal, it would be another resource.
It's not even instead of coal at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I could kind of you talked about how large corporates and industries and these really behemoths have kind of come to dominate almost every sector in India's economy. Um, what then that I mean that then kind of probably also then implies that even if you were to do something else, whether you're doing lithium or cobalt or nickel or so, something that's supposedly more important for the energy transition piece, how do you kind of get away from that? Vasudha kind of ended her presentation on this with this suggestion around a legislative framework which kind of puts it down on paper that you have to do that. But the rather sinister story that you told seems to indicate that it's harder to do it, even if it's there on paper.
Yeah, I feel like it really doesn't matter what sector it is, whether we go into oats or other things, because the way it's done on the ground and whether people are involved in the process of uh, uh, doing it in a right way. I have not seen it happening irrespective of the mineral you pick. It's the same story over and over again, where it is a collusion of local government, the privileged elites of villages, and the government sitting in Delhi. People on the ground are just consciously kept off uh, the table, and or select few are involved to make the decision. What the examples that I saw in the several villages that I was reporting in, that it was mostly the most marginalized, like Dalits in the villages, who were not kept into the conversation, or they always feared speaking up about that if they didn't want the mine. I spoke to some 10 or 12 Dalits in the village that I was working in. All of them kind of said that we don't mind them, we don't want the mine, but we fear speaking up against the privileged elite who has already said yes. So there are all these dynamics playing out in the villages.
Well, to
So it
both
really
of
is
you, just
what over you pick. Yeah.
sorry,
No, I was just
apologize.
saying
I
that
didn't mean
it
to.
doesn't, yeah. No, I was just saying that it really doesn't uh, matter which sector you are looking at, because none of the processes just doesn't seem equitable on the ground.
I wanted to kind of just follow up on that just for another minute before we move on to the other topics. We've historically kind of had a tradition of strong community movements against some of these types of large projects. I'm kind of thinking of the Chipko movement. I mean, the enormously powerful Narmada agitation that may or may not kind of have had an impact on the final outcomes or so. Has that changed? Do you think kind of there is less less ambition for inclusion, especially at the ground level, or is that kind of something or was of a certain point in time that is kind of hard to do now as kind of these huge projects go forward, whether it's in coal or in new energies? Anyone? I mean, I didn't mean to kind of put any one of you on the spot, but just to kind of get your perspective, if you have any thoughts on that.
I'll just quickly say that based on my understanding that it's hard to sustain movements for too long. I mean, the same things we have seen with Narmada, and what we are seeing even in the coal movement, especially in Chhattisgarh, which I have looked at. Whether you talk to movement leaders who are sitting on the top or those who are working on the ground, everybody talks of these highs and lows in the movement, depending on how the kind of decisions that the government is making, how the crackdown is happening. So it's not the question of what's happening now. I think it has been the thing always. The movements have these phases. Sometimes they're strong, sometimes they're not as strong. They want to keep the movements inclusive, but it's just hard to sustain them for too long, which is what even the Chhattisgarh movement is currently struggling with. As the communities see the mines being cleared, some of them just don't see the point of going to the protest site over and over again when they see another order coming from a local government that the mine has been cleared or the trees are going to get cut. Anyway.
So that if I can kind of bring you into this conversation, one on this issue by itself, but also will you kind of talk to the role that subnational governments, especially state and kind of then local level governments, what role could you think that they would play in making this more effective in terms of including communities in decisions that are being made that clearly affect them materially, but are not kind of necessarily in their benefits? I mean, I like this description about how in some ways kind of these large corporates come in, set up schools, hospitals, give money for weddings, almost like benign dictators without necessarily acknowledging the wants and aspirations of these communities. So is there a institutional way of trying to resolve some of this?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Kaushik, and I really wonder what would be the best way to answer that question. I mean, there could be an optimistic way, and there could be a more pessimistic way. So, I mean, it's how you see it. I think, yes, of course, there could be an institutional way, and and I'm sure Ankur will relate to this, having interviewed and worked with many bureaucrats and officials of different persuasions at different levels. I'm not convinced that there is one such thing as a bureaucratic mentality. I think there are really very different kinds of officials. Some are quite committed to bringing in people's voices into dialogues. But I think there is a larger sort of extractive force which is driving states and which is driving our development trajectory. And I do think that there is increasingly, it's harder to see how political parties are standing as different on this issue. I don't find a big political party level engagement with these questions. I may be wrong, Ankur might have seen something which I haven't, but I really don't see this becoming a political electoral issue, one that really is debated in that sense, where different parties take a stand. And I think that very rarely do we see a divergence of opinion on these issues in a political sense. And I think that does impact upon the ability of states and institutions and bureaucrats to actually do things very differently, because there is a larger sort of imperative, if you see what I mean, which is described in the literature as an extractive imperative. So there are certain broader sort of things that states need to do, and I do think that over time there has become a sort of routinization of not taking on board the views of people on the ground in ways that actually do matter. And I don't see that changing just because we are calling it a just transition.
And absolutely. I mean, it's a very sobering and a humbling thought, given how large these populations are and how large the impact of all of these changes is on these very large populations. It's something that's something that's just kind of unimaginable scale of transformation that I don't think we've kind of seen since the growth happened in China in the late 80s and 90s. One thing that kind of always kind of strikes me in all of these conversations and descriptions is that you are creating a extractive industry to power the rest of the economy, growth in GDP, generate more electricity so that you can have more steel and cement mills and the like. But you are unable to still make sure that the little light bulb and a charging point and a fan in someone who is part of that industry is delivered and works. And this, I mean, this dichotomy is remarkable given just the sheer smallness of need that there is at that local point and how easy it is to kind of resolve that. I kind of heard both of you kind of talk about that, but I mean that must also kind of reflect in the huge amount of frustration that these communities face as these changes happen. Would you talk to that for a minute? Ankur, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I'll sort
Sorry,
of
go.
briefly respond, and then I'll pass over to Ankur. I don't have much to say. I mean, Ankur will have more field level insights, but I think it's when we think of these things, it's helpful to understand the larger sort of relationships that these communities are entangled with other powerful stakeholders in the area, whether they are government officials of different departments, land revenue or forest officials or company officials, private, public, so there is a certain, it's obviously it's not at all an equal relationship. So most of the times they are locked into sort of an extremely disadvantaged position while bargaining for anything. And I find that there is oftentimes the treatment of people who are at the receiving end is with extreme contempt. So so it is not particularly surprising that they are also then deprived of. I mean, if they don't have land, they don't have housing, then what are they going to have a bulb on?
Ankur?
I mean, I have actually the same response. Yeah, I mean, there is nothing more I can add to that Vasudha has really said, how it's really playing out on the ground. Yeah.
Is there an aspect to just kind of physical and social mobility here in terms of if you are at the receiving end of such a developmental pathway, where do you go? I mean, do you run away and join the informal huddle of masses in Mumbai or Delhi? Do you continue to move to another area, geography, another forest that allows for your growth and your kind of family and social life to continue? Is
I
this
feel like
something
it
that
depends on.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just responding to. I feel like different people, based on their social and economic standing, are making different decisions. Like that's what I've seen. Some move to the cities if they can and develop a different future for themselves, send their kids to schools. But a lot of them, especially if they are from historically disadvantaged communities, they just live there and make their decisions in the same area, negotiate what they can, but they really don't have a lot of choice in terms of what else they can do. A lot of it is determined by what people from the privileged communities or local leaders are doing, the jobs that they have for them, what the companies are telling them to do. I remember when I was just getting out of these villages, I was asking people, what are you doing these days? A lot of them were still working for Adani or whichever company, if we are talking of other states. And I would ask them, so what's your job there? And these are people from, they're not literate, so they can't do sort of like timekeeping work or other things, they would say that we work in the land department. What do you do in the land department? Our job is to just go around the village and see who is protesting and talk to them to not protest. And tell them about the benefits of the mine, why they should give the land. So people actually have sometimes such jobs within the village to sort of keep this conversation going of why it's important to give the land. So they're essentially doing what they can. They don't have much of a choice.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. That the sort of extreme constraints of opportunities is what's shaping imaginations. That's the point I was trying to make, and this is why there is a real rush towards grabbing any last sort of naukri or job that can be obtained in a company, and it's not very easy because there is an increased and noticeable trend towards, essentially no one gets a permanent job anymore. It's all essentially short-term, more contract-based, precarious work. But that is, and this is what I really do wonder, that it is such an incredible felt need that there is people just want a job. And they don't necessarily want a job somewhere else. They would rather just be able to be in that area and have jobs there. I think they leave as a last resort, is my understanding. It's not something that they really enjoy doing. And that is also a tension because there is increasingly the kinds of extractive interventions, they are not extremely employment generating. So there is a need for land, but not labor.
There's an interesting kind of proposal in the chat about a carbon tax and using kind of revenues from that carbon tax to help the redevelopment of these communities. I kind of wonder how a lot of that might actually work out. I mean, at least at the national level, there are a huge number of announcements and initiatives that kind of India has put forth. But there's a kind of role for that kind of financing. There's also kind of a role for perhaps the multilateral and bilateral developmental agencies. You mentioned also the work that GIZ is supporting. There's kind of chat about the UNDP supported Jharkhand Just Transition Task Force. Would you kind of talk to some of these so-called international bodies trying to intervene and help the process?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know a lot about carbon tax, but what little I've read, they don't seem to be very easy to execute. I mean, because of course you're hurting the most powerful stakeholders in the corporations, the big bad guys. And why would they? I mean, governments don't seem to end up executing them. I don't know. Are there any successful initiatives of carbon taxation globally? I haven't come across too many.
Well, I mean, this is kind of some work that I do. So there are some examples of successful carbon markets which have taken kind of decades to come through. So this is, for instance, the European EU ETS trading scheme. There are some regional initiatives. India has notified a carbon markets legislation last June, and that's kind of work in progress. But it's hard to imagine that revenues from something like that going to local communities, and those are carbon markets. We've historically had a cess on coal in India, but last I checked, it was sitting in a budget with the Ministry of Environment, with some of it going to reforestation, though I do not know how effective or not.
Yeah, I think that these, I mean, carbon markets are slightly, obviously, you know that a lot better than I do, Kaushik. They're obviously quite different. You can still carry on engaging in your polluting activities as long as you pay somebody far away to do something and you buy some credits to that effect. Carbon taxes could be a much more direct way of making you sort of think twice about whether you want to actually do that. I'm being simplistic, I know, but I don't know if there is enough, if there will be enough political consensus around really implementing a wide-scale carbon tax. I think it would be great, but would that be, is that something even being considered? I don't know. But what there is, I mean, we know that there are district mineral, and they call district mineral foundations or DMFs, a district mineral fund, sorry, where there is meant to be a certain fund available at the district level where a certain proportion of royalties collected need to be funneled back into the development of those precise mining areas. Again, the literature on that, the reports on that do not encourage us that they are being utilized or utilized for the purposes that they are supposed to be utilized for.
We're coming to the end and we have last few minutes left. Vasudha, you kind of started your presentation talking about how big coal is in India. And over the last week or so, the kind of announcements that have come from India just talk to the magnitude of some of these numbers. The government now forecasts kind of India will get to about nearly 2 billion tons of coal by 2030. I mean, that's an increase over the remaining 4 or 5 years or 6 years of the magnitude of what all of Africa consumes today. I mean, I'm just talking about the increase that's happening, or what, the fourth largest coal consumer in the world, Germany, consumes in a year. So, I mean, the numbers are incredible. But there's also this notion about technology kind of solving a lot of these issues around everything. The famous quote from the oil business is one that goes on to say that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. So one of the participants has kind of put forth this idea that perhaps kind of this technology moves so fast that we don't have to be that reliant on this kind of fossil fuel energy. It's hard to forecast the future. I mean, I've tried to do it a few times in the past and I've gotten it wrong very many times. But do you guys do you see technology as being a solution to a lot of these challenges? Kind question, I promise. Ankur, you want to give us a sense?
I don't know, it's hard to answer because at least on the ground, I really haven't seen enough examples of it to talk about, and I don't fully understand how technology can be used to make the processes more transparent, equitable in some sense, because the larger powers that are at play and how they are controlling the flow of information, who gets to hear what, I'm not able to see what technology would do in this case. Yeah.
Vasudha, final thoughts on this?
I mean, similar to Ankur's, I mean, I think being someone who's interested in politics of development, I would see technology as operating in a different realm outside the social context and the context of power. So I would see that it's sort of how it's deployed itself is, operates within a very unequal field, will then produce similar kinds of unequal effects. Sure, it could have progressive implications, but it wouldn't just be because of the technology. It would be because of how it's implemented and the social coalitions around that. So I think we have to be careful. I mean, I welcome technological advancements, but we can't see them as operating in isolation from the social field of power in which they are handled. So that's
yeah, absolutely not a panacea at all. And what several of us kind of call above ground factors matter perhaps a lot more significantly than what lies below the surface. Thank you both. This was such a tour de force. This kind of I've learned so much through this conversation. I do see the importance of this kind of scholarship, this kind of activism, and this kind of effort being central to us being able to kind of manage a version of a world which is not as inequitable as it is today, a lot more just in terms of where we end up in the next few decades. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining today. And thanks also very much to our enormous online audience, your contribution in terms of your questions, comments, has been truly, truly valuable. As important as these conversations are, it can continue to engage with us and the speakers in our series. As I mentioned earlier, the full video recording of this event will be available on Center on Global Energy Policy's website in the next few days. Our next climate series will be on Mahartu Today's Environmental Injustice on the 22nd of March, 2024 at 10 a.m. again, Eastern Time, New York. This is in honor of Dr. Ambedkar's Mahar Satyagraha of 1927. I do hope all of you will be able to join us then and have another fruitful conversation. For a full calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day and the weekend and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.